Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Big Jiu-Jitsu Show. Don't forget to check out our sponsors, Trap and Roll Soap Company and Rolls Gear, and you can find all of our old episodes at bjjshow.com. I'm Rob, and Randy and I, we talked about the book Opening Closed Guard. It's the origins of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and it's written by Robert Drysdale, and it's a book I've been meaning to read for a while now, and Randy actually got to read it. So we discussed it a little bit on the podcast and talked about some of the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where it came from, and maybe some of the more overlooked details. So I found it to be really interesting. I'm really excited to get back home and read this book, and we hope you guys want to jump in on this book as well. So if you like what you listen to, please give us a review on Facebook, like us on iTunes, follow us, and buy a shirt, buy a patch at bjjshow.com. And we really hope you guys enjoy this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the Big Jiu-Jitsu Show. I'm Rob.
I'm Randy.
And another couple weeks gone by, another podcast. I mean, for me not being there, I guess this is a pretty good, pretty consistent schedule we're keeping for chatting about jiu-jitsu and working out and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we're doing good. I think we missed maybe like a day or two here or there, but I mean, we both have a lot going on, so I think we're doing pretty good right now.
Heck yeah. So I know you and I talked about it. We'll probably get some guests when I come back. It's only a couple weeks till I'm back, so start prepping that. It gives a little more flexibility on what we're doing. But how's your week been, or week or two been, since we've last chatted?
Oh, well, so I have the joyous experience of being on quarantine again. So I've been out of jiu-jitsu this week. So hopefully I'm hoping to be back. I've been gone all last week into this weekend, so I'm hoping I can go back starting up tomorrow. I got to get tested today at about 4:00 to verify that I don't have the vid, and be back at it. Symptom free. I'm good. Everybody in my house is good, but we did have an exposure, and my girlfriend did test positive. So of course I had to stay in. So that's been my week. But the benefit of staying in for an entire week and not doing jiu-jitsu, there's not much benefit, but the only benefit is staying on my fitness. And I finished a book about the history of jiu-jitsu. It's
nice.
On my screen, but it's the opening. It's called Opening Closed Guard by Robert Drysdale. So,
and that was something we had talked about last episode, I thought, too. Like you'd said that you'd picked it up, started reading it.
Yeah, I mentioned it. So yeah, I was able to finish that. That's what happens when you have nothing but time, because your Buffalo Bills are out of the playoffs and you can't do jiu-jitsu. So, the only default is reading a book and scrolling Facebook.
I did get to watch that game live out here, and I've never seen a cooler game in my life, and I really wanted the Bills to win, and I'm real sorry, man.
It was tough. I mean, our history, 4 straight losses in the Super Bowl back in the 90s, plenty of terrible, awful years in between, and then finally get back-to-back AFC East champs, back-to-back defeats to the same damn team. It sucks. And that game was amazing. I'm super proud of the Buffalo Bills for their efforts. Josh Allen's amazing. He's a superstar, but damn it, that sucks. So
yeah, I honestly, like, watching, I was like, dude, they need to change the overtime rules, man. Like, you pretty much give one team no way to respond to.
Yeah.
No,
I agree.
Yeah, it should be almost like beer pong, in my opinion. If they're able to get a touchdown, you have to respond with a touchdown, like that next drive to make it. So
yeah, college football rules, essentially. I mean, it should be.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, coin toss. I'm not going to make excuses. Hey, those are the rules at the time. Bills lost fair and square. Kansas City is a phenomenal team. Not casting any shade there, but I agree. I think the rules should change. And ironically, Kansas City talked about how their desire for the rules to change because they lost much in the same manner to Tom Brady.
Yeah.
So a couple of years back, they lost that same way. Brady drove down the field and they couldn't stop it. Game over. You should always get a chance to respond.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. So you said the book's called Open and Close Guard, right?
Yes.
Can Could you give us kind of, you said it was like kind of the unofficial, not the unofficial, but maybe a little different take on the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Correct.
Give us a little rundown of it if you can.
Yeah, so Robert Drysdale, of course, that's a household name in the jiu-jitsu community. Very, very successful competitor, fought in I think the UFC, right? I know he fought professionally mixed martial arts, been around for a long time, phenomenal instructor. So he basically always at heart, and I feel much the same way. I'm not sure how our listeners or how you feel about it, but has always kind of doubted the regurgitated history of Ilio Gracie. He had three different versions, right? I mean, first he had Ilio Gracie saying that he learned jiu-jitsu by watching his brother teach jiu-jitsu. And then it was, well, no, it wasn't from watching Carlos. It was, first he learned from Carlos, and he learned from watching. And then the third one was he invented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in its entirety, which we can all kind of doubt. And then it goes even deeper into kind of throwing a little bit of doubt at the fact that Carlos Gracie even trained directly with Count Coma. So, there's that whole thing. So it goes into basically he goes and does a bunch of research, and he travels to Brazil and Japan, interviews people in Brazil, Japan, and the United States that have a lot of history themselves. There's a book that came out years ago that now I want to get my hands on called Choke, and it's spelled Choque. And that guy, the author of that book, wrote it in Brazil, but it's been translated in English from Portuguese, and basically covers a lot of the same stuff that this book delves into. But Robert Drysdale wanted to get some interview time with these people that haven't had a chance to tell their story and their involvement in jiu-jitsu. I mean, I didn't even know. This is how little I knew. I thought I knew. I know my lineage. I know the basics of jiu-jitsu, the story that's told. I'm good. I didn't even know there was a guy named George Gracie. Did you know that?
George Gracie.
George Gracie.
I don't think so.
Has a significant role in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Really?
But he's left out completely by Carlos and Ilio of the history. And that's purely because, from what the interviews led people to believe, that he was left out because he was more of a traveling Gracie. He was actually one that fought in a lot of different matches, but some of those matches were fixed, which apparently was a really common occurrence back in the day. Ilio's matches were all legit, but George had a couple fixed and had a bunch that were real, was a traveling jiu-jitsu guy, taught a lot of different people in different regions, but didn't get the credit because he didn't follow the diet and the philosophy of Carlos Gracie. So he got left out of the history. So there's a lot of interesting things that come up in this. And what I like about it is he doesn't give a definitive answer. I would encourage everybody to read it because I think it's important to know more about the history of jiu-jitsu. Obviously we know that it's closely related to judo, but then learning the difference between jiu-jitsu and judo. And then there's even arguments in the judo world about what was being taught in Brazil when they immigrated into Brazil from Japan to teach. Were they teaching Japanese jiu-jitsu or were they teaching judo? So, because obviously we know Jigoro Kano is a guy that created judo.
Yeah.
But my understanding for a long time has been that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came directly from judo. But it's called jiu-jitsu, and why is that? So there's a lot of arguments on, and you'll see history definitely repeats itself throughout martial arts over the years. The same arguments being had. Here's a prime example. You and I come from traditional backgrounds prior to getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA. You said you trained Taekwondo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I trained in Kung Fu, Wing Chun Kung Fu, right? So we both come from traditional backgrounds. We did a little bit of it with Aikido. And so when you look at it, I'm sure everybody out there, including yourself and I know I have this, had a grandmaster or a sensei that told a story about the history of their martial arts system where some master lived in the house of a grandmaster and learned the true style of martial arts, right? They learned some secret version of that style that was more effective than what everybody else learned, right? Am I close to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What was the story you kind of heard? Was it similar to that?
So it was more or less, I was joking around one day because if our listeners can't tell from the podcast, I'm not exactly the most serious person when it comes to almost anything. Like, I have the ability to be serious, but I'm definitely like more of a pain in the ass when it comes to like class ends and stuff. Like, if somebody's teaching, I'll shut the fuck up, stuff like that. But I remember one day it was like kind of like a smaller class, and I asked the master at the time, I'm like, so is there like some like secret technique where I could punch a man and his head explodes or some shit like that? And he's like, well, there actually is. When you get up to a certain rank, there are some uh, quote unquote secret moves for the art. And the way he kind of said it, I think he was more or less like not joking, but there are moves that aren't taught but kept away for like, and it's the real version of Taekwondo, because not the style we're learning was too, because it's more kicking than most, because Taekwondo is based on kicks, because Korean soldiers had to kick people off of horses. I mean, but I was an impressionable teenage kid trying
Right.
to, learn how to fight. And I was like, all right, cool, man. Fucking Koreans had to kick people off of horses. That's why we do it this way. All right.
Yeah. Well, so Wing Chun had a very similar story. You have different lineages in Wing Chun. You got some that are called Wing Sun and Wing Sun, Wing Chun, all these different titles and all this crap. And the same thing, I was a teenager and very impressionable and huge Bruce Lee fan. And Wing Chun obviously was the first style that Bruce Lee trained in. So I was sold, man. And William Chung, which was the grandmaster of the lineage that I trained under, delivered this message, and every one of the other guys said the same shit. It was that they trained with Ip Man and learned this secret style of Wing Chun, which was the true Wing Chun. All the other ones were watered down versions of Wing Chun. They learned the real one. And William Chung apparently lived with Ip Man for a number of years and, learned this secret style. And it was absolutely just, looking back in hindsight, being a grown man with logic, it just was completely asinine. It was such a stupid, egotistical thing to say. And then when you read about the history of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're like, oh my God, it's the same fucking story echoed again, almost to a T, the same fucking story again, with Carlos and Ilio. And I'm not trying to disrespect those two guys.
Yeah.
It's probably a marketing thing. Brazil is obviously, it's a completely different lifestyle than what we have here in the United States. And I'm sure that back in the day when they were doing this, it was a different time and they had to do what they had to do to make money and draw attention and awareness to what they were doing. And regardless of how anybody feels about how they delivered the message in the beginning, you have to give credit where credit is due. And in the Gracie family, we would not, I feel confident in reading this book and knowing what I was told before and kind of meeting somewhere in the middle, right? Because there's two sides to every story. The truth usually lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
I'm still convinced that we would not have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the same form or fashion in the United States that we do right now if it weren't for the Gracie family doing what they did.
Yes, I agree. I
So
will
it's
agree with that.
right. So it's almost kind of like an end justifies the means type of thing in a way. It's undoubtable that the Gracies brought Jiu-Jitsu to America. That you can't question.
Right.
And the UFC was huge and a lot of things they did in Brazil were huge, but there are other names that deserve credit and respect too, and there's other lineages other than the Gracie family. Right now in the United States, I would say 99.9% of people that learn jiu-jitsu at some fashion or some point in their lineage comes back to the Gracies.
Yep.
But there are other families. And I think that that's something we need to look at. He actually, one of the other interesting things in this book I thought was really, really cool in a weird way. I don't think I'm going to go to this length, but he started referring to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as Brazilian Judo because when he did all his research and started really tracing it back and interviewing these people and got to the Japanese and the Judo side of things and started researching the connections there, he found that really what the Gracies were doing was a very specialized version of Judo. It's just that they were focused primarily on the Newaza aspect of it.
Yeah.
They weren't doing the takedowns as much. It was almost like a flip-flop of what we see of Judo right now, which should be consistent with what we know, that in a traditional Judo school right now, you've got about 60-40 takedowns and ground, or 70-30 in some schools. And then in Jiu-Jitsu, it's the opposite of that. You have 60-40, 70-30, 80-20 ground versus standing, all depending on how sport-oriented they are versus self-defense. So I thought that was really interesting. He started calling it Brazilian Judo. I don't think I'm going to do that.
No, I'm not going to go that far.
we know it as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's going to stay that way. But definitely interesting book.
I was going to say, like, I don't know. Have you ever gotten to participate in any judo classes or anything like that, or
Yeah,
trained with like?
I
So
have.
yeah. So then and maybe our listeners don't know so much, but like the first judo class I ever took, I'd been doing jiu-jitsu for probably about a year. It's my friend. She's a judo instructor, and I remember rolling with one guy and like trying triangles and arm bars and stuff, and he said like, "Oh my God, how do you know these moves already?" I'm like, "Oh, to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu." And then this is before I really knew the connection of judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm like, oh well, I mean, there's an intersection somewhere in here. That's kind of like where I was at that point. But it's pretty obvious like where it came from. If judo's
Oh,
using, like you said, the Newaza, judo's using the same ground techniques we stole from. And then I've had the privilege of working with having some judo guys come in as well and hang out, and I laugh and about pretty much we're just copying homework sometimes from the
yeah.
judo guys. And Drysdale is known for his judo as well, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, yeah, he does have some good judo. I mean, I think there was a point in time, and it's funny how my opinion has changed. There was a point in time, so I did judo. It's probably honestly with the same girl that
Yeah, because
Small
we
World
talked
Shit.
about her. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I mean, I've got nothing but respect and admiration for judo. It's different. It's the two arts have gone their own directions, but still, it's an amazing art. A lot of fun to train in too.
yes,
but but back then, I thought that my judo was something, or my jiu-jitsu was, you know, I guess what am I trying to say? My jiu-jitsu game needed better takedowns, and I figured that the best art to plug in would be judo because they're so closely related. Basically, be like completing the art, right? If I
yeah,
trained in judo, it would connect seamlessly to my jiu-jitsu, my ground game. Um, what I've since done is I've kind of changed gears, and I tend to work more on. There's still wrestling or jiu-jitsu or judo style takedowns, but I've kind of gone on the wrestling route because I feel like for me in particular, my game, wrestling takedowns tend to work better for me. Um, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. Is I lean more toward wrestling, and then what I thought was interesting in the book is he kind of touched on wrestling and judo. So there, if you look at the history of judo, judo changed a lot to fit into sport realms, and they changed their rules to reflect the sport aspect. And so judo, they actually took out and they banned double legs and single leg
yeah.
takedowns in competition, right? So now you're restricting that art a little bit. And so it's ironic to see how both arts on opposite extremes kind of did the same thing. I thought that was really strange and really kind of cool. I mean, because they even touched on how judo at one point was influenced by Western wrestling. So there was even crossover there, and you're starting to see a lot of that in jiu-jitsu. How much do we see of crossover and bleed over from judo into jiu-jitsu, wrestling into jiu-jitsu, sambo into jiu-jitsu? We see arm drags and all these different things that definitely were not originally jiu-jitsu curriculum. It came from something else, and it bled over into BJJ. So, but yeah, no, I agree with you. Judo's an interesting style, but you definitely do, depending on where you go train, you see how they format it. So when I went to the school I went to, which I think was similar lineage or similar instructor for where you went,
Yeah.
the front half of the class, of course, you practice your break falls and did all that. Then you had whatever the takedown or takedowns were that you were working on that day. You get your technique aspect in there on those takedowns. And at the very, very end, and it wasn't every class, at the very, very end, they would do a couple rounds of Newaza. And what I found interesting was that, obviously on the feet, man, they were throwing me around like a rag doll. But on the ground, I had no problems,
Yeah.
zero problems. And I think, and now they had good ground games. Like they would have no problems against somebody that didn't have any training. But you took a solid blue or a purple belt, and now that solid blue or purple belt is giving their black belt a hard time. And that's, you see the same thing if somebody came to a jiu-jitsu school that didn't work on their takedowns. You could take somebody who's very low ranking in a judo
Yeah.
system. They're going to toss that jiu-jitsu player around. So
No, but I mean, the connection is very cool. So you talk about George Gracie, like one of the lesser known Gracies. Like, is there like who are some of the other families that I guess
I'm terrible with
aren't talking?
names because a lot of them are Japanese or whatever. But you've got so many different names in here of people that should have been involved, but for whatever reason were not. And so let me go into where they have some of the names listed out here. So you've got, obviously, we all already know Jigoro Kano, founder of judo. You got Mitsu Maeda, who supposedly was the one that Carlos trained directly with. There's actually no historical evidence of those two ever trained directly together. And this is where another name comes into the puzzle, in Gio Amori and Jacinto Ferro. So Jacinto Ferro supposedly is who Carlos Gracie trained with directly in his exposure to judo and jiu-jitsu, and ended up kind of leading down that way of creating Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or what we know today as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You've got Donato Perez de Reyes, who's another guy that allegedly Carlos Gracie and Elio Gracie kind of learned from. He was one of their senior students, wasn't their direct master, but was kind of a senior student.
Yeah.
So you've got George Gracie, which I've already mentioned, Luis Franca. Let's see. And you got people that he interviewed in here, but you've got the Ono family that had kind of a little rivalry with the Gracies for a while. So there was George Gracie, Oswaldo Gracie,
I've heard
Gustavo
Oswaldo.
Gracie.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, there's so many names in here. There's the Sa family. So the Sa family was another lineage completely separate from the Gracies. So you got the Sa family, but it just goes on and on with these people that didn't get any credit whatsoever. And it's honestly sad. But it even talks about the very top of the hierarchy. They kind of did a little flow chart here to show some of the influences. And so you've got at the very top, your jiu-jitsu and Western wrestling influences were actually above Kano. So Jigoro Kano was influenced by obviously his jiu-jitsu studies. And this is jiu-jitsu, not JIU. This is like JU, like Jiu-Jitsu, back in its origins in Japan, plus Western wrestling kind of influenced Jigoro Kano to create judo, right? And that created the Kodokan, which is kind of the source for all our judo. And then Gio Amori learned from the Kodokan and from Jigoro Kano, and then it goes down from there into George Gracie actually learned from Gio Amori. Carlos Gracie learned from Donato Perez dos Reyes, Jacinto Ferro. All these different names influenced that. And then it trickles down from there into what we know today is Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
Interesting.
So names that got completely cut out of history because Ilio wanted to sell this idea that he was the inventor of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But then the counter argument I thought was interesting was that toward the end, he actually interviewed with the Valente brothers, which we all know the Valente brothers are a huge advocate of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, but they're also, just phenomenal Jiu-Jitsu resources in general. And one of the Valente brothers actually said, well, technically it's kind of a play on words. Ilio never said he invented any actual martial art. What he said was that he basically created Gracie Jiu-Jitsu as we know it today, in that he influenced the creation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the style. So you've got Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, which is one of the oldest martial arts systems out there. And there's all these stories and lineages and tales about where that came from. Some people say it came from India. Some people say it came from China. There's all these different little deviations there. But that you had, at some point, somebody created Japanese Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
And then at some point, Jigoro Kano said, I'm deviating off of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and creating my own system called Judo. Right. And then from there, you had somebody came along and said, well, we're doing something completely different, and gave it a name and called it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that's what Elio Gracie claims. My issue with that is the stories about training directly with this wise Japanese master and living with them and learning some secret thing, all that shit. I'm not a big fan. Maybe it's because I'm a realist, but I would prefer the truth. Okay, so you trained under the lineage of Mitsu Maeda, right? You trained under the lineage, but you actually trained with this Donato dos Reyes or Jacinto Ferro, who were the instructors that taught, who actually did learn from Mitsu Maeda. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do see what you're saying, because
Okay.
I still feel like maybe up for, okay, there's always been this mysticism behind martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of moves and a philosophy that can have one person be able to defeat damn near any untrained person ever, right? You go from, you know, movies, I think like the 50s are kind of where it started like picking up, with kung fu cinema and,
Yep.
even some American films as well. I'm trying to remember the guy's name, but he actually had a judo fight in one of his films, and it was like the first ever movie recording of judo used in like, a fictional setting or whatever, right?
Right.
So I consider judo a traditional martial art just because of its roots. I guess you can kind of say the same thing about jiu-jitsu, but that's a different conversation. So you had all this mysticism. You get up to like watching kung fu in the 70s, the TV show, Bruce Lee, all of this stuff, right? And so everybody has this image of like, this is how the real shit was taught. You pretty much were a slave for the master and did
Mhm.
whatever he wanted, and you like scrub floors, and then he taught you all the great moves like we talked about earlier in the episode. And
Yep.
then for a brief moment, that's when the like UFC showed up and started, having this guy who's a seventh degree master in like, some far off kung fu version or whatever. And like Ken Shamrock just picks him up and slams him and just punches him in the face, because
Yeah.
while Ken Shamrock wasn't a jiu-jitsu guy, as a submission wrestler, fought, Pancrase in Japan. And so we started to kind of get into this little portion, at least from my observation, this little portion of like combat based martial arts is the reality. And some people start saying, they're like, oh yeah, karate, that shit's stupid, man. You should do some fucking Muay Thai or whatever. And then they themselves usually never do it.
Right.
But now like with Cobra Kai, because also I binge watched Cobra Kai last
Oh,
night because
love it,
I
man. Absolutely love it.
fucking great show, great
Yeah.
show. Like some of my friends and family who are still like Taekwondo instructors are saying like they've seen an increase in people coming in and kind of like having this impression of, this is the way martial arts should be type stuff. And I'm like, that's fair.
Mhm.
Nobody like, if you told me Brazilian Jiu Jitsu was like, it was created by some guy who just wanted to fuck people up and just didn't really give a shit and didn't, he just learned from a whole bunch of different people and said, yeah, this style works. Like 20-year-old me might have been like, yeah, that sounds kind of stupid. Like nowadays, about dope. If it works, it works. Like,
Well, and I think that's the key, right? Is knowing what you're doing it for. Because
yeah,
you and I are the same in this way. We train what we train in. I am a martial arts nerd, regardless. I don't. I may joke around and talk shit, about Taekwondo or Krav
yeah,
Maga or whatever, But at the end of the day, if you want to train martial arts because you just love martial arts, you're not in it for the self-defense applicability. You're not in it to go compete in some tournament in grappling or mixed martial arts, or you're not in law enforcement or military where you need it for your job to stay alive. Then if you're just training it because you love it, I don't care if you do the white crane style kung fu. I don't care what you do. Martial arts is beautiful. It's amazing. I love
yeah,
martial arts movies. I love kung fu flicks. I love, Cobra Kai. I will watch documentaries on Krav Maga, even though it's not my favorite system, to train in personally. But I love martial arts across the board. I just love martial arts. I've trained in Aikido. I've trained in Kung Fu. I've dabbled in Shaolin Kung Fu, like at the little outlet malls in Buffalo, New York. You had some guy that said he was teaching the animal styles of Kung Fu. Like I've done that. You know what I mean? It's
yeah,
martial arts is amazing to me, and it always will be, and it's always going to be a staple in my life. But you just got to know what you're doing it for, and then don't lie to yourself about what you're doing it for. If you're going and you want to train in Master Chong's Taekwondo next to the mall and the burger joint because you just want to do martial arts because you watched Cobra Kai and you think it looks awesome. First of all, you should probably look for karate because that's what they're doing in there. But second of all, um, whatever, just go train, go love it, go enjoy it, and be great at it. I don't care. Um, the other thing that I thought, and it kind of connects well with what you're talking about, that he talks about in this book, and I really do embody this to a degree. And everybody has their own flavor and their own taste, right? He talks about how, if you go to traditional judo school, and this was much my experience, the one I went to, there's a code of ethics. There's a certain, I don't want to say rite of passage, but there's a certain practice that has to happen. You bow to the mats, bow to your sensei, bow to your fellow students, whatever, at the beginning and end of your class. When I did Nihon Goshin Aikido when I was a teenager, it was very formalized. Only
Yeah.
white gis, they had a picture of the creator of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba, up in the center with the calligraphy pictures next to it and a candle that was lit, and you had to get down your knees and bow down to that first, then you bow to your sensei, then you start class. Everything was very, very traditional. And judo schools a lot of times are like that. Jiu-jitsu, though, not very often. Very seldom is there that level of formality. You might have to bow before you walk on the mats, but every school might have its own level. I know that there's Roberto Godoy has a school now in Raleigh, and he has a more traditional approach to his practice. Then you've got a little bit removed from that. You got shell shock jiu-jitsu, which still has some formality, but less than that. Come to TFTC, we have none. I mean,
Yeah.
other than giving a right away to the senior students when you're rolling and shaking hands into class, that type of thing. Other than that, man, just come train. Have good hygiene, be respectful, come train. That's about it. So I do kind of miss a little bit of that, though, to a degree. Not to the element that it's a false, like you're representing a false god or something, but I do miss a little bit of the formality. I think it's important to have that code of ethics and kind of have that in your school, because for the kids and for the teenagers, you're developing a sense of discipline. I think that's important.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed, that traditional schools get, like, they have it down to a fucking science
Yeah.
dealing
Yeah.
with kids. I mean, I'm not saying jiu-jitsu schools cannot teach kids these ethics or, discipline, all that. But what I'm saying is, like, the primary moneymaker and the primary focus I feel of a lot of martial arts schools is the ability to teach children and get them, like, on the mindset of, like, better grades, listen to my parents, don't be
Yeah.
an asshole at school, stuff like that. So, like, I think the formality kind of does play into that, I feel, but how much, I'm not one to say. I really don't know. And this is coming from a guy, and yes, I'll admit I still do the taekwondo from time to time. Both my sisters and my brother-in-law do it, so I'm sorry. Like, I still gotta kick a few times and you know swing nunchucks around or whatever. But
It's fun,
it's
man.
fun. I love it. So,
Yeah.
but jujitsu is still my primary style. But what I'm saying is, like, for the discipline aspect, the formality aspect, I think it works well with kids. I think
Yeah.
it's a great tool for that, and traditional schools have that down, man. Like, they've been doing that in the U.S. since what, 1950s? Like I said before,
Yeah.
they've, like, I think, like, the first judo or karate school or something opened up, I think maybe the 40s or 50s, something like that. And that's not counting, like, Bruce Lee, the kung fu guys, and was in L.A. or
Yeah.
whatever, but like ones that were open to anybody, like, 40s and 50s,
Well, yeah. And I
20s.
mean, you had so Teddy Roosevelt trained in judo,
Yeah, gangster. But I think that
So
was
I
like
mean,
private tutor, not a actual
it
school.
was.
Yeah.
They talked about that in the book about how judo, when it first came to the United States, was seeking out a lot of like the dignitaries, the high paid, wealthy, powerful individuals. That's who they were teaching primarily to. And they brought it up because Elio Gracie and Carlos Gracie, when they first opened their school and eventually the Gracie Academy in Jiu-Jitsu, they were catching a lot of flack from people talking about how they only taught to the upper echelon or the richer people in Brazil. And it's like, well, judo did the same thing. Like,
Yeah.
everybody kind of does the same thing. You're trying to make money, you're trying to make a livelihood. But they did have an entire group of people that were teaching in the unwealthy section of Brazil, and actually refused to move over and join up with the Gracie Academy because they wanted to continue to offer free classes to the unwealthy kids of that community, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. I mean, it's a labor of love at that point. You're no longer doing it for strictly for cash. Like, if I go out, I'm like, hey, Bill Gates, I got some shit for you that, you can kill anybody with this stuff. Like, at that point, I feel like I'm just seeking it out for money's sake.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, those guys, while granted it doesn't pay the bills and it doesn't feed you, are doing it for the knowledge and the wealth and the sharing of both the wealth of knowledge that they had. I'm sorry, I can't
Well,
even
I thought it
talk.
was interesting too. The other part that I think is worth mentioning is, when you look at the belt system and promotions and how that occurs. So back in the early days of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, basically it didn't have this traditional ranking system. That was actually influenced by judo and by the Kodokan. They realized they needed to kind of have this system in place for promotions and recognition. And so initially it was different shades of blue. So you'd have your white belts, you have like a light blue and a navy blue. Navy blue were the most senior students. They didn't have a brown belt, a black belt, all this stuff. Um, and so I thought it was interesting when they talked about that's where the navy blue belt that Ilio wore toward the end of his life, that's where that originally came from. He was basically standing up in protest to the traditional belt ranking system, but not because he felt that people were getting promoted too soon or anything like that. He didn't really look at it that way. That was up to the instructor. But what the Valente brothers talked about was how Ilio Gracie was standing up in protest to the traditional belt ranking system because people were getting promoted to black belt that didn't even know self-defense. They only knew sport jiu-jitsu. That's what he was protesting. And that I can really honestly respect the guy for, because if you're going to get a black belt, you should know a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B. Sure, specialize and be good at what you're great at, but you should know a little bit of everything about the system before you become a master of it. And to only be a master of a very specific element, does that mean that you're, just because you're super athletic and super gifted in your application of jiu-jitsu, does that mean that you're more of a master than somebody that knows the self-defense aspects, the philosophy of it, the technique of it, can teach it really well? I mean, everybody's better at different elements. The reality of it is, anybody listening, you could be listening right now and have a brown belt or a black belt. I'm wearing a four-stripe brown belt, and I'm saying right now that there are blue belts out there that would mop the floor with me, right? Super athletic, strong, gifted, intelligent blue belts that all they do is eat, train, sleep, and shit jiu-jitsu, and they would beat my ass. Does that mean that I don't deserve the belt I wear? Absolutely not. Been doing this for 13 years, teach it to law enforcement, military, teach it to civilians. I deserve the belt I wear and I'm proud of it. But that doesn't mean that I can beat everybody that's not a brown belt. It's just not the reality. It's not it.
Yeah.
Never going to be. And you're always going to have black belts that are, look at, if that was the case, then Gordon Ryan is the only person that deserves to wear a black belt in his weight class. Is that doesn't even make sense. And in addition to that, they talked about how, and I hate to call it out, but I'm call it out, even though I do have respect for them. Henner and Hero and Gracie with their online blue belts.
Yeah.
They talked
Well, they
about that a
stopped
lot.
doing that though, didn't they?
I think so. I hope so. I know that they're still giving out some semblance of promotions online. They have their whole system on there, the master cycle and all this crap. I mean, you came straight out of Obson Gracie and a bunch of other Gracie's mouths on here about how that there's no way that Ilio Gracie would support that, because that's just that. Look at the reason why he wore that Navy belt toward the end of his life, and it tells you there's no way that somebody can learn that shit online. Jiu-jitsu is a community art, man. I got to be able to put my hands on you and roll with you. You got to be able to impose your will against me, and I got to be able to defend it. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And I think it's a damn shame that those guys are doing that. When you look at, when I said earlier about pick why you do what you do, I mean, I do this because of my profession. I do it because I love it. And because of that, I have to be picky about what I bring in and what I teach to my officers. Because if it's not realistic, I'm not going to fucking teach it.
Yeah.
And the issue with that is, I think Hero and Henner have done a great thing, a great service to law enforcement, military, by creating Gracie combatives in the GST system. But people need to stop taking that as the gospel and just regurgitating that system. They need to start really realizing that you have to pick what works for you and doesn't work for your population. My department, what it's capable of, is different from what the military is capable of, or what a different police department needs to do. And then within those departments, you have different units that have different missions, and not all those techniques aren't going to apply.
Yeah.
The Gracies aren't cops. They've never been cops. They've been teaching, interesting enough in this book, they've been teaching the police and military since inception, since the beginning, which is great. They taught the Navy way back in the day. It's awesome. But they're not cops. They never have been. Not a single Gracie up until Hoist recently has ever been a police officer. I don't know if you knew that, but Hoist actually got sworn in as a reserve officer.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if it was like a reserve situation, like, hey, Seagal did it, and Hoist could beat
Oh
that
God,
dude's
don't.
ass. No, I'm just
No.
saying. No, I'm just saying. If Seagal can do it,
Yeah,
fucking any competent martial artist can do it.
Shaquille O'Neal was a reserve officer.
Yeah, I'm not taking away from it. I'm not taking away from it. I'm saying like Hoist Gracie of all people should be one of the people who should be a fucking reserve officer.
Oh, 100%, 100%. Which they interviewed Hoist in this book too. I would strongly recommend everybody check this book out. It's actually really good. It's interesting to read. I had a lot of time to kill, but it was still really good. I hope that film comes out soon. I'm really curious to see that.
I'd like to watch it. Well, I mean, I already ordered the book. It's sitting at home for me, so I'm pumped to go read that when I get back.
Yeah, man.
But no, I did not mean to insult Hoist Gracie or reserve officers. I meant that as like if Steven Seagal, if Jefferson Parish is like, we'll let fucking Steven Seagal film a show here. Then you have a guy who actually trained law enforcement and isn't, has fought people and
Yeah.
isn't just a piece of shit. He could, be a reserve officer.
No, absolutely. But Shaquille O'Neal was a reserve officer. You know that he actually kicked in the wrong door one time on a search warrant? But the family didn't even care because
it was Shaquille O'Neal. Dude, if Shaquille O'Neal kicked my door open, I'd be like, I'll let this one slide.
If I was sitting there watching TV right now, drinking my coffee, and Shaquille O'Neal just burst through my door like the Kool-Aid man, I would not be that upset.
Like, come on in, man. Have a cup of coffee. The deal is pay for the replacement door and sign some shit, and we're good.
He's one of the nicest guys in the world. That guy would buy you a nicer door than you started with. I guarantee it.
Probably. I bet you honestly didn't have to use that much for like just how giant he is and how like physics work. He probably didn't even have to like do like a Sparta kick. He probably just like was like trying to almost like kicking a soccer ball, just kick it off its hinges.
Oh, dude. I mean, that guy, one leg, he could probably one-legged squat more than I could even think about. So in my last thing is this.
Okay.
Anytime anybody tells you a story that their master lived with some other guy and learned some secret techniques and stuff, just automatically call bullshit on that. So funny story on my side is if I ever try to tell that story, it would go down like this, because this is true. Back when I was training in Wing Chun, not my predominant Sifu, because he was a great guy. He's still teaching down in Florida. But I had a Sifu. I was trying to find one that was closer to me because Wing Chun was not offered in Buffalo, New York at the time.
Yeah.
Tried to find a Sifu closer, and I found one in Brampton, Ontario, in Canada. And if you know anything about Brampton, Brampton's a shithole. Okay.
Oh God.
So I found this guy. He was part of the same lineage. He was on the website as being a legit instructor. I'm like, all right, cool. This guy's like 2.5 hours away. And back then, my mom was like, hey, whatever, I'll drive you wherever you want to go to train martial arts. So I go up there to Brampton a couple times, train with this guy. Seemed legit for what Wing Chun is. He seemed legit. And long story short, he ends up coming down to Buffalo one time. He's like, yeah, I'll come down there, man. I'll stay with you guys for a couple nights, and you get a bunch of private lessons in Wing Chun. I was like, oh, that sounds great. Sounds awesome. So he comes down, and for 2 nights, he basically drank until he passed out and fell asleep on my couch. That was the extent of having a master stay with me to learn secret techniques. And I was about 15, 16 at the time.
Oh, hell yeah.
So
sounds like Cobra Kai almost.
Right? Like it only been better if it would have been like Coors Banquet. But that's reality. There's a difference between reality and fantasy. That's reality. Anybody that tells you that they lived with a master for so many years and learned secret shit is living in fantasy. And they were probably drinking Coors Banquet, passing out on a couch.
I mean, I'll take that second half. That sounds pretty good to me. But before we finish up this episode, Randy, you have anything you have to say to our friends and listeners out there?
Nope. Thanks for sticking with us. We need to get some guests on. We'll get some guests your way soon, and maybe some other surprises. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm pumped for the stuff coming up. Like, it hasn't been just idle talk. Me and Randy talked about hopefully something, not the near future, but a definitely future project. We hope it pans out well. So once again, thanks for listening to the Big Jiu-Jitsu Show. You can find all of our old episodes at bjjshow.com. Check out our sponsors, Trapper Roll Soap Company and Rolls Gear. And I'm Rob.
I'm Randy.
We'll catch you guys next time.